It's just like Malcolm X said. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. Plymouth, to me, it's not America's hometown. Plymouth, to me, is nothing more than a continuing the mythology. We don't see any reason to celebrate the arrival of the Pilgrims. What the heck did they do for us? Nothing. My name is Mourning James. I'm a member of the Aquina tribe of Gay Head, co-leader of United American Indians of New England, and an organizer of the National Day of Mourning. The truth is that the first Thanksgiving was not in 1621. The first Thanksgiving was in 1637 because Governor Winthrop decided that he would give thanks for the safe return of the people who went to Mystic, Connecticut and participated into the massacre of the Pequot. That was the real first Thanksgiving. And we tend to look at it as like, hey, first thankstaking. Here it is, Plymouth Pebble. If anyone thinks that this is where the Pilgrims stepped ashore, like I said, they had unbelievably long legs. My father started National Day of Mourning in 1970 because he had been invited to address a big banquet of dignitaries and all this kind of thing, and they asked for a copy of his speech in advance, which he sent. And then within days, they came back and said, you can't give this speech. It's too inflammatory. The Pilgrims and the Indians sat down to a beautiful dinner and lived happily ever after. The end. He was censored. Plain and simple. It got out under the Moccasin Telegraph, and a few hundred indigenous native people came to Plymouth and they declared it a National Day of Mourning. And this year marks our 48th year of being on this hill. Really, and that's what this all means, the oppression, and the oppression has not ceased. It hasn't ceased. We continue to experience it. Every time I read that, and I do have to stop because that's hard. It's hard to read it. That's what Day of Mourning means. We stand here in our circle, we have a prayer, we have whatever, and then we speak.
Every inch of this land is Indian land. We are as strong as ever.
Our rates of suicide, our rates of alcoholism, poverty, all these kind of, nothing's really changed. But every year when we come here, we're trying to at least make people aware of things like that. It's just so ridiculous. We're all human beings. I think the problem is they think that we've disappeared. We have not vanished. We have not been conquered. We are still here. What else can I say?
Whose land? Whose land? What do we want? When do we want it? Now.
Thanksgiving for us is a day of mourning because it represents the day when the Pilgrims first settled here in New England. and they started their reign of tyranny and genocidal acts amongst the indigenous tribes. We shouldn't be teaching children 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Columbus was a murderer and a rapist.
Since the invasion of Columbus and the rest of the Europeans, Native people have been virtually non-stop victims of terrorism.
It's complicated because I also want to spend time with my family, and we do have the tradition of celebrating Thanksgiving, but there's definitely a big part of me that every time we sit down for Thanksgiving wants to talk about injustice and the fact that we're like living on stolen land.
We tried to feed them and take care of them because the Pilgrims wouldn't have made it through the winter without us. And they paid us back by savagely abusing us and murdering us and enslaving us, stealing our crops.
Hey everyone, welcome to Find Your Boots. If you don't know your roots, you can't find your boots. This episode is about the National Day of Mourning. So right now, I guess the opening prayer ceremony is going on because it won't be streamed. So in the meantime, I will take you to the rest of the playlist. If you go to our YouTube page, you can follow along the playlist with us. It's called Thankstaking. It's one of our playlists on YouTube that you can check out. Let's go to last year's National Day of Mourning, held next to Plymouth Rock on what is called by consumers Thanksgiving Day.
So my wife got me this weird
Of
new
course.
tool for Christmas.
Gotta love
And at first,
the
I thought it
ads,
looked kind
right?
of crazy.
There we
Like
go.
Columbus Day, many indigenous people do not want to get rid of Thanksgiving Day. In fact, they say many Thanksgiving Day traditions are perfectly fine. But they say what the holiday stands for needs to change. There were drums and dancing on the hill overlooking the Plymouth Rock Monument as hundreds of people came together for what they call a National Day of Mourning.
Currently, we are in a time of indigenous resurgence with things happening on so many different fronts.
After speeches and prayers, the group marched through the streets, led by the granddaughter of the man who founded this event in 1970.
I wanted to deliver a message basically that we're still here.
Keisha James says she doesn't object to people gathering, eating turkey, and giving thanks, but she doesn't want them to celebrate what she calls the Thanksgiving myth.
That the Pilgrims and Wampanoag got along, and we simply know that that's not true, that the Pilgrims came and pretty much immediately started killing the Wampanoags.
Marchers also called for more attention to be paid to the cases of missing indigenous women and the return of all land colonized in the Americas.
We're not saying give it back and get off. We're saying give it back so we can heal it, so that we can all come to some type of reconciliation.
Organizers say they are encouraged to see people of many different backgrounds taking part this year, and said the Day of Mourning is also a day to be proud that after 400 years, they and their culture still exist.
We are still here today, and I stand here in peace and in solidarity. Ho, that is all.
Now, in years past,
Well, as you know, folks, many of us are getting ready to celebrate Thanksgiving, but for Native Americans, the day is filled with a painful history. A group of indigenous leaders are now teaching a new generation what happened to their ancestors. Beloved Alive's Don White is at Georgia State University as part of our Voices for Equality series.
The weather is cold, but inside Georgia State University's Rialto Center, the feeling of community is warm.
We bleed just like you do. We live in homes. We drive cars. I drive a red pony, but it's a Camry.
Monica Ponson-Arrington, who leads Georgia Indigenous Diversity, is educating these students on how Thanksgiving came about.
The natives welcome the pilgrims, the Europeans, which is true. That's what happened.
But unlike what's in many history books, Monica says Thanksgiving was not a happy time for Native Americans.
The pilgrims actually did a celebration that they had taken the food, taken the harvest from the people. That was their celebration, that they had taken the harvest.
She says the pilgrims killed many indigenous people and made their children slaves.
We consider it a day of mourning now, and we do celebrate, but not a celebration of Thanksgiving, but a celebration of having family come together.
The lesson is eye-opening for many of these young people.
I learned that the hardships that they went through, it's easily to relate to me because I come in from a different background too. I've had to go through hardships.
What can you do to honor Indigenous people on Thanksgiving? Monica encourages you to watch a documentary or learn about Native Americans in Georgia.
We're letting people know that we're here, that our homeland is here, and we don't plan on leaving anytime soon.
Monica leaves a lasting impression on the students.
Before coming to the new school, I wasn't so confident in my artistic abilities.
The second Thanksgiving is what's represented right here on this pole. Mystic Massacre is what we call it. The Pequot War. It goes by many names. It happened in 1637 down in Connecticut. Owners of the now established Foxwoods. The Pequot people were burned alive in the middle of their sleep at night in 1637. Mass Bay Colony, Plymouth Colony, Providence Plantation, Mystic Seaport, all English colonies banded together to burn women and children while they slept in a village at night. They barricaded the exit. They did not allow anyone to leave. They wanted them to burn. They were proud that they burned. This country was proud to write. We could smell their burning, rotting flesh for over a mile away. It's written, folks. Please read it on your own. I am not making this up. Stephen King can't make this up. He was so proud, the town of Norwich, Connecticut, had a statue honoring this man up until roughly a decade ago. John Mason, the man who murdered over 700 people. When anyone, the few people who were able to survive that Holocaust, they were rounded up. They were sold as slaves. Before they were sold, they were marched all the way from Connecticut to Mass Bay Colony, present-day Boston. They were placed on trial. They were declared to be sold as slaves. But before they sent them on that slave ship, they had to humiliate them some more. And they read a declaration that those people shall not ever, once again, even utter the word Pequot. They will no longer be able to call themselves a Pequot. I am proud to say I'm a Mashantucket Pequot. This is the history, folks. Because that particular day, that particular incident is when this country declared its second religious day of Thanksgiving. This is what we're celebrating, folks. And for all of you who took pictures of me with my nice little pilgrim head buddy here, I hope you get the story that goes with it, because anyone who sees this, I'm sure, thinks I'm a sick, twisted individual. This is a reminder. This is what Hallmark greeting cards and Charlie Brown cartoons should be showing when we celebrate this holiday every year, when we celebrate Columbus Day every year, because this is what it represented. I'm going to shut my mouth so we can get on way with this march through town, because we need all of you who are here to get this story out to the people. I can only visit so many schools in this time that I am here on this earth. And I can only visit those who are welcome to hearing the truth and invite me to do so. I encourage all of you to do the same. I look out and I see in this crowd, I see some people that I've been at their schools, and they are here now standing in solidarity. I really appreciate this. It means they're listening. Somebody's listening, and they don't appreciate what's going on. This symbol right here, we're going to march all the way around, and we're going to make one stop at the church where King Philip's head sat on a pole until it rotted for over 20 some odd years. For those of you who do not know who King Philip was, he was the man who started the most patriotic uprising this country will ever see, when its native people stood against these forces. And this manner of warfare during King Philip's war, when King Philip abducted Mary Rawlinson, she reported in her own writings, she was treated with far greater respect by this savage than she was by her own people. Our women were topless. There was no rape. We did not need abortions. The word matumwasus is what we call our women. It does not mean woman. It means she who makes all decisions. We had a high respect for our women. That was something Pilgrims never understood and still does not translate into America today. Square buildings that cost us so much to heat, to build, to cool, because we're sheltering ourselves from what's going on in the natural world. I've never seen a bird build a square bird's nest. That is the most absurd thing, and Americans still repeat this European nonsense. When are we going to come up and show the rest of the world what should have always been there when we first tried to get our teachings across in the 1600s? Listen to us. We're not saying we're better. We're just saying this works in nature. This here pole, King Philip, when he was killed, he was cut into pieces. The man who killed him was a Wampanoag, shot him in his own back. He got the hand of King Philip, Metacom. He got to parade around anywhere in New England, any tavern he showed up with that scarred hand of Philip. He got free drinks as long as he was there, because people were proud of him, that he had killed his own people. His head was severed, King Philip's head. King Philip is the son of Massasoit. Massasoit comes running to these people's aid just a generation before. And that's when they supposedly had their first Thanksgiving. Well, their third day of Thanksgiving was declared when they brought his son's head in on a pole and left it to rot for 20 odd years. So I'm going to walk this around Plymouth right now, and I'm going to remind folks of what we're celebrating here today. And I encourage all of you to get out to a library, get out to a school, even if it's your own. It better be your own kid's school, because this is what they're teaching your kids. I excuse my kids from school whenever they're being asked to dress up as pilgrims and Indians. There's so many injustices still going on every day here, folks. Every day. This language I have to speak just so people understand me on my own continent is a tragedy. I hate these clothes. There is so much we talk. This pavement on my hunting grounds. Our clams being polluted. These clams make my stories. My ink doesn't smear. We need our history. These things are still important to us. I was very glad to hear my Lakota brother speaking about what the land is still important to us as Native people. Not all of us are about casinos. Many of us still believe the origins for why we were put here in the first place, to protect this land and to maintain the balance amongst all creations. Plant, animal, winged, fish, finned, does not matter. We are all beings here on our Mother Earth. So I'm going to ask all of you to please stand with me. I don't care what race you are. I don't care what religion you're from. I don't care if you're Romney or Obama. We're human beings, and we need to stand up for humanity.
Greetings, my relatives, friends, and supporters. It is with great honor that I get a chance to speak with you, even though it's a written message and someone has to read it to you. I'm saddened that we have to call this a day of mourning, but we must take every opportunity to remind this nation when it comes to keeping their word about treaties, about human rights, about the environment, about excessive pollution, that it has failed miserably on all those concerns. Also, I want to remind the major religions that speak about peace, love, brotherhood, and are celebrating this thing called Thanksgiving, that we, the native people of this, realistically, overall, have nothing to truly be thankful about regarding the arrival of the pilgrims. And I would also like to remind the major various religions of this country that in all their teachings, it says you reap what you sow. And if that is a true statement, if that is the law given by the Creator, then you have to only look around at the news of the day to see what that statement is coming to pass. This country is not keeping its solemn word under God that it gave regarding our treaties. And they don't keep their own scriptures. And they say not to bear false witness or lie. And they've tried to keep us from honoring our fathers and destroying our culture. They violated their word where it says, "Thou shalt not kill." Violated every one of their commandments regarding our people in this land. And they will truly reap what they sow. I also want to say that in the spirit of compassion and reason and fairness and forgiveness, and it's never too late to turn things around. Actually, I should say that's not quite correct. It can be too late. That's an old Cheyenne saying that a nation is never destroyed until the hearts of its women are on the ground. And if you look around, you will see the decline of America. And it is entirely possible that that teaching is not far off. One thing as a people that we do have to be thankful for, and thankful to the Creator only. And we still live. We are still a people. And we still know who we are. We still have a commitment to the Creator to protect this land. We still have a commitment to protect the laws of nature that were given unto us, to our ancestors. We are probably the only people on this continent that would be better off if this whole system fell apart, because we possess the knowledge, the teaching, and the culture to live in harmony with what the Creator has given to us. I want to encourage all young people to always remember that your health, the health of the earth, are the most important things that you possess. And that self-discipline is the most important thing that you can learn. Taking responsibility for ourselves and our future is the most empowering thing that we can do. Right now, you are listening to my words, the words of a man in prison for 30-something years. A man who has limited contact, and yet I am able to speak to you now. And the reason I am saying this is because with all the freedom that you do possess, you could do so much more. Educate yourself to our true history. Educate yourself to what is really going on today, and educate yourself as to what needs to be done to make a better tomorrow for yourselves and your children's children, our future generations. Again, I want to say I am an ordinary man caught up in extraordinary circumstances. There is nothing that I have done or said that you cannot do or say. Much better because you possess more freedom than I do. We need each other. I am ever to be free. I need you. And the truth is, none of us are truly free right now, because any people who is afraid afraid of their government is not free. We all need to be warriors of one.
Yes. Yes.
Each needs to know how to defend themselves on any level. And as I have said before, we need to recapture the freedoms we've lost, protect the ones we still have. In closing, I want to encourage each and every one of you to stand up in your own way, in whatever way you can, for what's right. Try to right what's wrong, and know that in my heart and whatever way I can, I will help you. That I will be with you also. We need each other. You need each other. And we need the help of all people to correct this great damage that is taking place throughout the earth. Our battle is not a race. Our battle is not with people of color. Our battle is with ignorance and greed that is ruling the governments of men today. Again, I want to thank you for the spirit of Crazy Monks and all those beautiful people that have stood up for what's right in the past and the ones standing up now. Stay strong and support one another. Your friend, always and in all ways, Leonard Peltier.
I failed all of my classes in high school and ended up dropping out.
The first Thanksgiving. American schools generally teach a conventional story about the meeting of Pilgrims and Indians that finished with an amazing dinner. The end. But there's more to the tale. This video will explain the events around the first Thanksgiving and how it's not the image ingrained in tradition. At the start of the 17th century, southern New England was home to a variety of busy communities within several confederations. These were the people of the first light, and they called their home the Dawnland. Political leaders were known as sachems and had been trading with Europeans for over 100 years before the Pilgrims. Relations soured only after deceitful Europeans kidnapped locals to sell as slaves. Permanent European settlement was impossible due to the already high population of native occupants. But in 1616, tradesmen introduced a disease to the Dawnland, whose inhabitants died in droves from a lack of immunity. In 3 years, up to 90% were wiped out in several confederations, including the Wampanoag. Their head sachem, Massasoit, was aware of how close they were to being subjugated by their unafflicted enemy, the Narragansett. He was determined to save his people from such a fate. This was the political world the Pilgrims were about to enter. The Pilgrims were not called Pilgrims by their contemporaries. They were known as Separatists, a branch of the English Puritans. King James hated Puritans and began persecuting them in 1604, so the Separatists fled to Holland, where they were free to worship. But because they feared losing their national and communal identity, the congregation wanted a new place to plant their church. They decided on America and asked King James for a patent that would grant them rights to build a colony. They planned to make a profit catching fish to pay off the debts to their investors. The Mayflower set sail on September 6th. 2 months later, Cape Cod was spotted and 16 men were sent ashore to inspect the area. Unfortunately, the settlers didn't know how to fish and food was running out. They resorted to stealing from graves, homes, and storage pits to keep everyone alive. Then came their first hostile encounter with natives, but no one was killed. On December 12th, they reached New Plymouth. They did not land on any specific rock, but folklore insists they did. Construction began in January. By winter's end, 44 settlers would be dead from bad conditions. In March, they were surprised when a man named Samoset walked into New Plymouth, greeting them in English. He told them they were building on top of a village called Patuxet, whose residents had all died from the recent epidemic. It belonged to the Wampanoag, and their chief, Massasoit, was watching them. The settlers were eager to trade, so 5 days later, Samoset returned with furs and companions, including Tisquanto. Known famously as Squanto, he had come to tell them in perfect English that Massasoit had arrived. After years of dealing with Englishmen, the sachem did not trust the newcomers. Edward Winslow was sent to be a hostage and declared the settlers' peaceful intentions. Satisfied, Massasoit walked into New Plymouth and was regally greeted by the governor. A peace treaty was created, ensuring mutual protection if attacked by enemies. With the help of Squanto, New Plymouth settlers began to fare better. He taught them how to grow crops and was absolutely vital as an interpreter. To the separatists, he was a gift from God. But in fact, Squanto had been kidnapped from Patuxet in 1614 and shipped to Spain to be sold into slavery. He ended up in London at the home of a merchant who taught him English and arranged for Squanto's return to the Dawnland in 1619. But Patuxet was now gone, wiped away by the epidemic. Massasoit took him in with suspicion because of his years abroad, but needed a translator to parley with the newcomers. He eventually sent his warrior Hobamok to live among the settlers and keep an eye on Squanto. By fall, the settlers had a bountiful harvest and a feast was held to celebrate. Massasoit showed up with 90 warriors and 5 deer for the meal. For 3 days, the English and Wampanoag ate and entertained one another. This was the famous first Thanksgiving children learn about in school. However, the word Thanksgiving would not have been used by these settlers to denote a harvest feast. For Puritans, a day of Thanksgiving was a day of fasting while giving thanks to God in prayer. But the story of Pilgrims and Indians does not end here. During New Plymouth's first year, Squanto had been up to something. Realizing his substantial power as the only English speaker of his people, he conceived a plan to overthrow Massasoit. He persuaded locals he could command the English to make war or peace at his will. Hobomok was suspicious of Squanto and warned Governor Bradford. Soon enough, they discovered Squanto's plot and informed Massasoit, who was furious. He demanded Squanto be handed over for a swift execution. Bradford refused. The interpreter was too valuable to give up. But according to the treaty, Squanto's life belonged in the hands of his sachem. Bradford finally conceded. He was about to hand over Squanto when an unidentified ship appeared. The alarm it caused delayed Bradford and worried Massasoit's envoys. Angered and impatient, they left. The ship carried 60 Englishmen planning to build a colony near Boston. They abused the Massachusetts locals, initiating a conspiracy to kill the colonists. Warned about the plot, New Plymouth's leaders launched a preemptive strike to save their impudent countrymen. It brought peace for a time. In that time, more Puritan settlers arrived, soon outnumbering the natives. And while the Pilgrims' treaty with Massasoit lasted until the sachem's death, other Puritans were not concerned with such alliances. Their fanatic religious principles ensured no peace between the two cultures could last. To Puritans, Native Americans were the other, wild, savage, godless. With such an ideology, the outcome was inevitable. If they did not convert to Christianity and surrender their cultural identity, they had to be eliminated. The first Thanksgiving was a brief moment of harmony between two worlds, but sadly it was short-lived. The capitalist opportunities the Dawnland presented, combined with zealous puritanical beliefs, were incentive enough to wipe away the native inhabitants.
You gotta go this way, you know what I mean?
Since they're still doing an open ceremony, I'm guessing I will post this link in the comments for you all.
So the marshals will keep telling you to slow down here and there, that kind of thing. We want to ask for indigenous, Afro-Indigenous people up front for all the lead banners. And everybody can get behind. And they are
Oh, this sucks too.
are forming up now over at this Chantal's bus over
well
here. There's a charter bus over here. And so people are starting to form
I'm
up
Amy
now.
Goodman.
So
In
we
this
are going
special
to
broadcast, we
march
begin the
Plymouth
show with the
Rock,
Indigenous
looking for
scholar and
permits.
activist Nick Estes. He's co-founder of the Indigenous resistance group, the Red Nation, and a citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe. His books include Our History is the Future, which tells the history of Indigenous resistance over 2 centuries, offering a roadmap for collective liberation and a guide to fighting life-threatening climate change. Estes centers this history in the historic fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock. I asked him to talk about the 2 Thanksgiving stories he writes about at the beginning of his book.
The first Thanksgiving story begins with the Pequot massacre by members of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which really marks in my opinion, the mythology of the United States as a settler colonial country founded on sort of genocide to create, ironically, peace. And then I begin with another story of a prayer march that we led in the Bismarck Mall in Bismarck, North Dakota, to kind of bring attention to the Standing Rock struggle during a Black Friday shopping event, which was met by police armed with AR-15s, who then began punching and kicking water protectors who were holding a prayer in the Bismarck Mall. And I thought it was a really kind of jarring sort of contrast between the past and the present, to say that while there are sort of differences between the massacre of Pequots in Massachusetts to the contemporary sort of fight against an oil pipeline, nonetheless, Bismarck, North Dakota is a 90% white community that originally the Dakota Access Pipeline was supposed to go upriver from, but then was rerouted downriver to disproportionately affect the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. And disproportionate is the language that the Army Corps of Engineers use, as if there's ever a proportionate risk to environmental issues and water contamination. So at this particular moment, there weren't any actions that were happening in the camps, and it was largely at a standstill. And I think at that Thanksgiving weekend, there was an unthanksgiving feast that was held in the camps, and it was actually the highest point of the camps themselves, in the sense that there were the most sort of water protectors had showed up. So I thought it was a good kind of contrast to show that this history, is a continuing history of genocide, of settler colonialism, and basically the founding myths of this country.
Your book's last words are, we're challenged not just to imagine, but to demand the emancipation of Earth from capital. For the Earth to live, capitalism must die. Explain.
So that line is part of, this longer section on liberation. And I think when we think about climate change, oftentimes the question of climate change really centers on market-driven solutions, such as green capitalism, and how do we create markets that sort of incentivize transition to sustainable economies, right? And I think really what we're kind of like beating around the bushes is that it's the system of capitalism that led us into this economic crisis to begin with. It's the sort of designation of certain populations in certain territories as disposable that has led us into our current epoch of global climate change. And so when we talk about who's going to bear the most burden when we transition, out of the carbon economy, it most likely is going to be those populations that have historically been colonized, and what's happening in Southeast Africa is a perfect example of why we need to transition away from not just the carbon economy, but capitalist economies in general. Because if we look at the history of how Africa has been a resource colony for Europe and for North America, we can look internally in the United States and understand that indigenous nations continue to serve as resource colonies for the United States, whether it's the Navajo Nation, where I'm living right now, that is producing oil and coal to generate electricity for the Southwest region, or whether it's the Fort Berthold Reservation up in North Dakota, that is, the ground zero for oil and gas development in the Bakken region. We have to understand that indigenous nations have largely been turned into resource colonies and sites of sacrifice for not just the United States, but for the oil and gas industry. And so we need to not just think beyond climate change and putting carbon into the atmosphere, but we actually need to think about the system, the social system, right, that created those conditions in the first place. And so capitalism is fundamentally a social relation. It's a profit-driven system, whereas indigenous sort of ways of relating is one about reciprocity and mutual sort of respect, not just with the human, but also with the non-human world. And we're undergoing, the sixth massive extinction event, which is caused by not just climate change, but is caused by capitalist sort of systems and the profit-driven sort of motive of our current economic and social system.
Nick Estes, you focus on 7 historical moments of resistance in your new book, Our History is the Future. You say they form a historical roadmap for collective liberation. How did you choose these histories? Just quickly take us through them.
Sure. So I begin at the camps. I begin in the present, at Standing Rock, and then I go to the fur trade with the first U.S. invasion, which was Lewis and Clark, who trespassed through our territory and were stopped by our leadership. And then I go through the Indian Wars of the 19th century and the Buffalo Genocide. And then I go into talking about the damming of the Missouri River in the mid-20th century, and then looking at Red Power in the 1960s and the 1970s, and how all of these indigenous people who were relocated because their lands were flooded by these dams eventually found themselves and created sort of the modern indigenous movement known as Red Power. And then going back and ending actually at Standing Rock in 1974 with the creation of the International Indian Treaty Council, which really coalesced these generations of indigenous resistance and took the treaties, the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, to the world and to the United Nations. And to do that, they looked to Palestinians, they looked to the South African anti-apartheid movement, who provided the mechanisms for recognition of indigenous rights at the United Nations. And that all resulted over 4 decades in the touchstone document, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was passed by the UN in 2007. And so in many ways, when we look at Standing Rock and we go down Flag Row and we see the hundreds of tribal nations. Nation flags that were represented in 2016 and 2017. We also saw the Palestinian flag that was there, kind of hearkening back to that international solidarity with movements of the global South, and specifically our Palestinian relatives who.